A pale sun hovered over the ramparts of Winterfell, throwing long shadows across the courtyard as the northern wind whipped through the ancient castle. A hush had fallen over those who gathered in the yard, and there was a thick, tangible tension in the air. Even the ravens seemed subdued, muttering only a few low croaks before taking flight. The gates stood open, welcoming an entourage from the far south, women known across the 7 kingdoms by whispered rumor and uncertain tale. Their arrival was unlike anything Winterfell had seen in living memory. The sand snakes of Dorne had come north. The first to pass beneath the arch was Obara Sand, astride a powerful black courser that snorted clouds of steam in the frosty air. She wore a leather jerkin reinforced with small metal plates, fit for battle, though the real threat lay in her direct gaze. Her spear, unornamented but lethal, jutted upward like a challenge to all who dared look upon her. Behind her rode Nymeria Sand, clad in supple silks beneath fur-lined riding leathers, her long whip coiled at her side. Tyene Sand followed last, seeming a sweet-faced maiden wrapped in a thick, velvety cloak. Yet Tyene's reputation, to those who knew it, brought more chills than the northern cold ever could. Flanking them were guards bearing the sun and spear sigil of House Martell upon their banners. Colors of red and gold clashed almost scandalously with the stark stone environment, a desert rose transplanted into the cold, unyielding granite of the north. At the head of the greeting party stood Sansa Stark, her auburn hair caught in the breeze, and by her side stood Jon Snow. Though cloaked in black fur and wearing the solemn expression of a leader, Jon was neither the naive boy of his youth nor the uncertain man of Castle Black. The hardships they had all endured, war, betrayal, the bitter cold, had sharpened him and put a certain steel in his gaze. Obara was the first to dismount, letting her spear rest for a moment in the crook of her arm. She bowed her head, stiff and formal, her dark eyes looking Sansa up and down as though appraising the quality of a blade. Nymeria dismounted more gracefully, her movements fluid and cat-like, while Tyene smiled a disarmingly sweet smile. Sansa stepped forward. She was no longer the frightened child once used as a pawn in King's Landing, but a resolute woman who had taken the mantle of Lady of Winterfell upon her shoulders. Her voice was clear when she finally spoke. "Welcome to Winterfell. You have come a long way for a meeting that many would call surprising." She tried to keep her tone measured, but an undercurrent of suspicion was undeniably there. Tales of the sand snakes were often laced with warnings of poison and cunning treachery, and the North had good reason to mistrust the South. "We come in peace," Tyene said softly, smiling again. One might almost call her shy if one did not know better. "The roads are dangerous, but more dangerous still are the times we live in. Our house wants peace as much as you do." Obara shifted her stance, spear tip twitching in the wind. "Peace? No. We come for justice," she corrected her sister, though she kept her voice level. "But peace may follow if we are victorious in our cause." Jon exchanged a glance with Sansa. In the past, they had known little contact with Dorne, but Sansa had gleaned enough wisdom in the Red Keep to be wary of every gesture, every courtesy. Even the most welcoming vow could be laced with a hidden threat. Still, the fact that the sand snakes had come so far, risking winter roads and potential ambushes, spoke to the gravity of their intentions. The question was whether those intentions aligned with the Stark's own. A breath of a moment passed before Jon gestured to the interior gatehouse. "Come inside," he said. "This wind is unkind to visitors. We can speak where it's warmer." Obara gave a curt nod, while Nymeria's amber eyes glided over the gathering of northern soldiers, taking their measure. In unison, they followed Jon and Sansa inside, their Dornish retinue trailing them with cautious steps. Curious eyes of Winterfell's inhabitants peered from windows and corridors, studying the desert warriors who walked among them. Gossip was sure to run rampant by the day's end. Inside, fires burned in hearths along the great hall, sending waves of warmth along the stone floors and oak walls. The ancient banners of House Stark hung overhead, gray direwolves upon fields of white, their regal presence reminding the newcomers of the centuries of northern history contained within these walls. The thick walls muffled the wind's howling, making the space feel like a sealed keep of uneasy calm. Servants brought hot mulled wine and hearty bread, setting them upon a side table. But few people seemed to have an appetite at that moment. They came to stand near the largest hearth. Jon and Sansa took their seats at a trestle table, while the sand snakes stood opposite. Only Nymeria chose to sit, gracefully arranging herself on the bench, while Obara and Tyene lingered just behind her shoulders. After a brief moment of quiet, Sansa nodded, urging them to speak. Tyene cleared her throat softly. "We have no reason to hide our intentions," Tyene began. Her voice, gentle as it was, still carried the echo of hidden knives. "The Lannisters took much from us. Our father, Prince Oberyn, was cut down in single combat he should have won. Our uncle, Prince Doran, was, well, we will not speak ill of the dead, but he was powerless in the face of the Iron Throne. Now the Iron Throne belongs to a monster. The monster who orchestrated the Red Wedding," Obara interjected, the corner of her lip curling. "Though we know the Boltons and Freys had their part in that, we do not forget Tywin Lannister's cunning behind it. He may be dead, but his brood carries on, continuing to shape events from the seat of power." Jon's jaw tensed. Cersei Lannister now sits the throne. She rules King's Landing, and by extension, the Crownlands. But we are no friends of hers. She's done enough to prove her malice to the north, to my family. Sansa's eyes flickered with memories of humiliation and suffering at King's Landing, horrors that manifested every time she recalled Joffrey's cruelty and Cersei's manipulative gaze. "We have made our stance clear," she said firmly. "There is no place for a Lannister on the Northern Throne, no matter how many times they might have tried to claim dominion. But forging an alliance with House Martell, or with those who claim to speak for Dorne, is still something we must consider carefully." Nymeria's voice was low, almost seductive in its quality. "We speak for more than just ourselves now. Dorne is fractured. Some lords question which path to take since Prince Doran's death. We three have sought unity, forging alliances with the minor houses that remain loyal to our father's memory. The sands are shifting, but those loyal to the Martell cause still stand behind us." "Dorne wants vengeance," Obara said, her tone unyielding. "We want the Lannisters to pay for what they've done. There's only one way to do that, as we see it, to overthrow Cersei once and for all. But to do that effectively, we need an ally who can press from the north, while we press from the south." Jon studied each of them for a moment, letting the possibility of such a grand strategy sink in. For years, the North had shouldered the brunt of the wars and the destructive weight of the White Walkers. Though the threat from beyond the wall had receded, thanks to alliances that once seemed impossible, the North remained weary, battered, and resource-depleted. Could they truly march south again, risking more bloodshed and agony for an alliance with these unpredictable Dornish warriors? But vengeance, that word resonated deeply with the Starks. The Lannisters had done more than just humiliate Sansa. They had orchestrated the downfall of the entire Stark family. Their patriarch, Ned Stark, was executed on the steps of the Great September of Baelor at the Lannisters' behest. Robb Stark, their once king, was killed at the Red Wedding, also a plot carefully spun by Tywin. And though Tywin was gone, his legacy wore a crown and wielded the power of the Iron Throne with a petty cruelty unmatched. Avenging the family was something Sansa had longed for in her quietest moments. Could she truly pass this chance by? Jon glanced at Sansa, reading the conflict in her eyes. He knew she wished for justice, retribution for all that had been done to their family, but he also knew her sense of responsibility. The North was recovering. Another war could break them. Still, the words formed in Jon's mouth before he could rein them back. Cersei Lannister is cunning. She has allies, mercenaries, the Gold Cloaks, and the threat of wildfire in King's Landing. She won't be easy to dethrone. Obara seized on his statement. That's exactly why we come to you first. If the North rises with us, the Lannister hold on the throne will shatter. They cannot fight on two fronts effectively. The Crownlands and the Southern Territories would be hard-pressed to hold back Dornish forces. Meanwhile, your men could march down the King's Road. Together, we squeeze them from both ends. The Tyrells are gone, the Baratheons are gone. Only the Lannisters remain in prominence. This is our window, if we do not wait too long. Nymeria added, we do not ask for blind trust. We understand that battles are not won on words alone. But Dorne is willing to commit men, gold, and resources, enough to bolster your cause. With the southern ports under our control, we can bring in goods more cheaply. The war, if waged carefully, need not drag on for years. Not if we strike swiftly and effectively. Tyene nodded in agreement. We would not have come all this way if we did not believe you are crucial to the downfall of the Lannisters. You have your own reasons to seek their ruin, do you not? Sansa's face hardened. She recalled Joffrey's crossbow pointed at her, the sneers, the casual humiliations, and how the entire capital laughed at her father's downfall. Yes, she said softly, steel in her voice. We do. Jon slowly inhaled, feeling the collective weight of all eyes on him. It was not lost on him that the men of the North would follow his lead. There were other pressing concerns, of course, such as the fractured alliances in the Riverlands, the still smoldering resentments in the Vale, and the unpredictable moves of those who might claim influence over the Iron Throne. But something about the Sand Snake's directness, their willingness to pledge soldiers and gold, stirred a sense of possibility he hadn't felt since the war against the undead. This time, the living foe was tangible, so perhaps they had a chance. Before Jon or Sansa could commit to anything, the distant horn from the watchtower sounded. It was a low, droning note that typically announced visitors at the gates. The conversation in the great hall paused, tension lacing the quiet space between. One of the guards approached, face pale with concern. "My lord," he said, bowing to Jon. "There is a small party coming up the King's Road. They wear the Black Lion on gold." Sansa exchanged a startled look with Jon. "A Lannister banner?" she murmured, her heart skipping a beat. What madness was this, that a Lannister retinue would arrive in Winterfell at the very moment the Sand Snakes came to forge an alliance against the Iron Throne? The guard nodded. "Yes, my lady. They are small in number. About a dozen men, no more. They request an audience." Obara's hand clenched around her spear. "Lannisters? Here? Is it some ploy? Or a peace offering?" Jon stood, his chair scraping on the stone floor. "Bring them inside," he ordered the guard. "Let us see what they have to say, but keep them under watch. Double the guards at the gates." Sansa rose alongside her brother. The Sand Snakes exchanged glances, each uncertain but preparing themselves for whatever betrayal might come. Their hearts pounded with a tension that coursed through every occupant of the hall. The sudden arrival of a Lannister envoy was either an incredible coincidence or a cunning trap. Moments later, footfalls echoed in the corridors. Into the great hall stepped a man garbed in a fine fur cloak, the golden lion of Lannister upon a field of black embroidered on his left breast. His hair was dark blonde, his face lined with cares, and a purposeful expression narrowed his eyes. Behind him stood 11 men, all bearing arms but keeping their hands well clear of their swords, at least for the moment. Jon and Sansa stood at the high table, with the Sand Snakes fanned out beside them. The contrast was stark. The gray and white gloom of Winterfell's hall against the bold reds and golds of Dorne, and now the black and gold lion of House Lannister. The tension was so thick one might have cut it with a dagger. The man bowed curtly. "Lord Snow, Lady Stark, I come bearing a message from Queen Cersei Lannister of the Seven Kingdoms." Obara let out a sharp snort. "Queen by her own declaration, maybe," she spat, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Jon raised a hand, silencing the outburst. "Speak your piece," he said, voice echoing softly in the hall. The Lannister envoy cleared his throat. "Her Grace sends her regards, and wishes to remind the lords of the North of their oaths of fealty to the Iron Throne. She invites you to King's Landing, to reaffirm those bonds and to discuss a peaceful future where the North can be guaranteed security, resources, and a significant measure of self-governance. In exchange, of course, for your loyalty." Sansa's lips parted in incredulity. How many times had the Lannisters broken trust, manipulated or brought ruin to House Stark? And now they had the gall to come here in person to ask for renewed fealty? She glanced at Jon, measuring his reaction. Jon's voice was calm, but ice-laced. The North declared itself free of the Iron Throne. We recognize no queen in the South. The Lannister envoy swallowed, but to his credit, pressed on. Her Grace offers a marriage alliance. She believes that uniting the houses is the surest way to prevent further conflict. She extends this invitation in good faith. Before Sansa could stop herself, she asked sharply, "Who, pray tell, is meant to marry into House Stark? The Queen herself is a widow, as far as I know, and her children. She has none left." The envoy drew a breath. "Lady Sansa, Her Grace has a plan in mind for your house to be elevated in the eyes of the realm. There are cousins of House Lannister who are unmarried, various alliances that can be forged. She suggests awarding you titles, lands, and a seat in the Queen's Council if you accept. She believes in bridging old wounds." Obara let out a laugh, loud and derisive. She glanced at Nymeria and Tyene, and the three nearly hissed in unison. The Lannisters had never offered them any olive branch. All Dorne had received from the crown was heartbreak, war, and the death of Prince Oberyn. Tyene's face hardened, a bitterness etched into every line of her sweet features. Jon's gaze flicked from the envoy to the sand snakes and back again. The presence of both parties felt explosive, like sparks near gunpowder. "So she wants the North to bend the knee and tie ourselves to Lannister fortunes? We have reason to distrust such generosity." The envoy bowed slightly. "Her Grace is well aware of the distrust, but the war with the dead is done. The Targaryen threat has passed, and now the realm needs unity. The North will be made to see reason, one way or another. She hopes it need not come to bloodshed." Sansa's spine stiffened. Beneath the table, her hands clenched into fists. For so long she had desired an apology, an acknowledgement of the injustices done to her family. Now, to hear these Lannister words, couched in the language of diplomacy, sickened her. A quiet rage stirred in her chest. Nymeria couldn't remain silent any longer. She stood, letting her whip coil around her arm. "Your queen is bold, sending you here with demands and promises as though nothing has happened. She forgets who truly rules in the North. She forgets what befell her father and mother, or else she simply doesn't care." The envoy's eyes flicked to Nymeria, then to the rest of the Dornish presence. "I see House Martell is represented here," he said, carefully measured. "Perhaps you would like to hear that Her Grace also extends an invitation to Dorne? She would see all corners of the realm come together." Obara let out a short bark of laughter. "We have heard quite enough from the Lannisters over the years. One of them slew our father, used trickery and cruelty. Another let the mountain run loose across our home. The atrocities? Do you think we forget?" The envoy spread his hands, attempting to seem conciliatory. "We wish no harm to you, my ladies. The past was unfortunate, but there is a new queen on the throne now. She seeks a new beginning." No one in the hall missed the irony. A new beginning brought by the very woman who had orchestrated the destruction of the Great September of Baelor, who had manipulated lords and knights to destroy her rivals. Sansa felt her blood pound in her ears. Perhaps if she had not seen firsthand the lengths to which Cersei would go, if she had not been tormented by Joffrey, she might have been swayed by some show of goodwill. But it was too late for that. Jon stood, stepping forward, his voice calm but carrying across the hall. "We have heard the Queen's offer. Tell her that the North does not forget. We do not need her generosity. We will not bend the knee." Sansa opened her mouth to reinforce Jon's statement, but the envoy held up a leather-bound scroll. "My lord, if you would at least read Her Grace's terms before you dismiss them." Something inside Obara snapped. Perhaps it was the memory of Oberyn's skull crushed beneath the gauntlet of Ser Gregor Clegane, or the knowledge that years had passed since Dorne was robbed of its rightful vengeance. She stepped forward, her spear in hand, expression lethal. "We have done enough talking," she hissed. Tyene's hand shot out to grasp Obara's arm. "Sister, we do not kill envoys," she said quietly. as though recalling an old rule of conduct, an ancient courtesy observed by lords and ladies even in times of war. The Lannister envoy paled noticeably at the sight of the spear. Winterfell's guards bristled, hands going to the hilts of their swords. The envoy's men began to shift uncertainly on their feet. Jon's voice cut through. "Stay your hand, Obara." They came under a flag of parley. "We do not dishonor House Stark by shedding blood in our hall without cause." Obara glowered, but she released her iron grip on the spear. Her eyes, though, spoke volumes. Nymeria's whip remained coiled but ready, and Tyeen's delicate hands rested at her sides, suspiciously close to the hidden sheaths that might hold her daggers. Sansa forced herself to swallow her anger, stepping forward so she stood beside Jon. She looked the envoy in the eye. "You tell your queen that the North is done with Lannister rule. We remember what was done to our father and mother. We remember the Red Wedding. We remember the torment we endured in King's Landing. We want nothing from her." The envoy bowed his head slightly, lips pressed in a thin line. "As you wish, my lady. Her grace will be disappointed." When he turned to depart, his guards closing ranks around him, the tension in the hall increased rather than dissipated. The question on everyone's mind was how soon Cersei would respond to this refusal. War was brewing again, like the first howling gusts of a winter storm. One could practically tee it in the air. Jon expelled a breath as soon as the Lannisters were out of earshot, glancing at Sansa. She met his gaze, seeing the swirl of concern and resolve. Then he turned to the Sand Snakes, who hadn't moved. "You timed your arrival well," he said with a wry edge to his voice. "Or ill, depending on how you look at it." Tyene let out a soft, humorless laugh. "It seems clear enough, doesn't it? Cersei offers terms because she fears unrest, but I suspect she's only biding time for her next strike. We can't let her gather too much strength." Nymeria spoke more gently now. "Your refusal to join her will not go unanswered. When Cersei learns of our presence here, she will anticipate a union between the North and Dorne. We have to be prepared." Sansa nodded. "We do. If we choose this alliance, we will have to act quickly." Silence settled on them for a moment, with only the crackling of the fire to fill the hush. Finally, Obara placed the butt of her spear on the stone floor with a resounding thump. "We are decided, then?" she asked. "Or do you still need to weigh your options?" Jon and Sansa exchanged a loaded glance. They both knew the cost of war. They had fought the army of the dead, lost friends, and seen villages ravaged. They had come so far only to stand on the precipice of another conflict. Yet what choice remained? The Lannisters had not atoned for their crimes, and worse, they continued to sow chaos. If the North did nothing, how long before Cersei sent forces to quell any perceived uprising here? Jon spoke slowly, as though feeling the weight of history pressing on him. "If we are to do this, we do it as allies. But understand, we don't march to war lightly. Our forces are still recovering from the long night. Winter has not been kind." Obara nodded, her face set with grim determination. "We Dornish know how to fight with limited resources. We've done it for centuries against every incursion the Iron Throne attempted to push on us." Tyene's voice softened a fraction. "We'll do all we can to support your armies. Food, gold, ships. Dorne is not as battered by winter as the rest of the realm." Sansa found herself exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "If this is our moment," she said, "we must plan carefully. The Lannisters have the advantage of the Iron Throne, the royal treasury, and the loyalty of many houses who fear retribution if they defy King's Landing. We have to be strategic or we'll be crushed." Nymeria dipped her head in acknowledgement. "Which is why we came here first. To plan. To coordinate." Jon turned to a cluster of his guards. "Show our guests to chambers where they can rest. Post watchers, but see that they're comfortable. We'll meet again at midday to discuss next steps." He paused, realizing the understated way he was referring to a monumental undertaking, unseating the Lannisters from the throne. Sansa looked out one of the narrow windows at the swirling flakes of snow. The cold wind battered the battlements, and the sky was a pale, unwelcoming gray. The alliance with Dorne was a long shot, a gamble that could plunge them back into war. But the alternative was to accept submission to the house that had brought unspeakable tragedy to their family. There was no real choice. That night, the great hall of Winterfell filled with soft candlelight. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted game and winter vegetables, spiced wine and honey cakes. Meager by the lavish standards of King's Landing, but a feast for the North under winter's constraints. On the dais, the Stark chairs were set for Jon and Sansa, while the places of honor were prepared for the Sand Snakes. Tension pulsed through the hall, for no one truly knew how to receive these southern women who had arrived with weapons in plain sight. Some of the northern lords who had sworn loyalty to Winterfell had begun arriving. Small gatherings, a trickle of men and bannermen as the word spread that something momentous was afoot. Obara, Nymeria, and Tyene entered together, a trio of graceful yet lethal figures, each wearing Dornish silks adapted for the cold by layers of fur. Obara's spear was left at the entrance, but there was no doubt she could summon it at any moment. Nymeria wore her whip coiled at her hip, a bold statement that made many of the northern men shift in their seats uneasily. Tyene had no visible weapon, but no one was fooled. Jon rose, gesturing them to their seats. "You are our honored guests," he said formally, though his voice carried an undertone that begged caution. "We thank you for sharing this meal with us." Sansa nodded in agreement, lifting her goblet. "May we find common ground and ensure victory against our common foes." The three Sand Snakes offered polite nods, taking their seats. Servants began ladling hot stew into bowls and filling cups with wine or ale. Conversation started in halting murmurs at first. Dorne and the North, rare allies, if they could even be called that yet, had centuries of separation and culture between them. It was Obara who broke the ice. "The North looks much improved from the stories I heard of the devastation wrought by the war," she said, glancing around. "Fewer signs of the dead walking. I am glad for it." Jon managed a faint smile. "We had help restoring the keep. Good men and women from every corner of the North came to aid us after the Night King was defeated. The scars remain, but they are healing." Nymeria lifted her goblet. "We celebrate your victory, truly." Dorne prayed for the fall of the White Walkers, though some there doubted the tales. Sansa nodded thoughtfully. "Many in the South did, but now, perhaps we can all refocus on the living enemies that remain." Tyene sipped her wine, then lowered her voice slightly. "Have your spies learned anything about Lannister movements in recent moons?" Jon set down his spoon. "We have a few eyes and ears in the Crownlands, thanks to travelers and old acquaintances. Word is that Cersei's hold is tenuous but bolstered by the Gold Cloak's loyalty and the presence of mercenaries she hired from Essos. The City Watch can keep the peace within the capital, but she doesn't command nearly as large a standing army as she'd like people to believe. Her real strength lies in the threat of wildfire and the fear she's cultivated. Few lords want to rebel openly, not after witnessing how she dealt with the Tyrells and the September of Baelor." Nymeria's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "That's where our southern approach will be critical. If we can divert forces away from King's Landing, or even lay siege to the city from the south, you could march down from the north. She would be pinned, but we need to ensure she can't pick us off one at a time." Sansa swallowed. "A pincer movement," she said quietly. "But we would still need to move enough men, enough supplies. The distance is great, and winter roads slow any army. It could take weeks, months even, to move our forces that far south." Obara nodded. "And that's why we must start positioning our troops soon. We can't wait for the snows to trap us further. Dorne's climate allows for year-round movement, but the passes that connect Dorne to the rest of the kingdom can be dangerous in harsh weather. If we're not careful, our armies could be stranded apart." Jon's brow furrowed. He glanced at his half-finished meal, appetite dwindling amid war plans. "We'll need to rally the northern houses that have pledged loyalty. Some of them may be reluctant to commit to another southern war. They fought for years during the War of the Five Kings, then again against the Boltons and then the White Walkers. There is a level of war weariness among our people." Obara's tone was flat. We are all tired of war. But are you prepared to let the Lannisters reign unchecked? They will come for you eventually. Tyene offered a gentler approach. We understand, truly. Dorne also lost many sons in these wars, and we're not eager to shed more blood. But the fact remains. Cersei is as dangerous as any threat. She will not stop until she has absolute control or until she's toppled. You know the Lannisters better than most, Lady Stark. You've lived among them. Sansa set her goblet down. The memory of King's Landing, of Cersei's cold eyes, Joffrey's sadism, all churned in her mind. She won't stop, Sansa agreed. Ever. We can't wait for the storm to pass. We have to confront it. Jon glanced around the table, noting the resolve in each of the sand snakes. Then his gaze fell on Sansa, seeing the determination etched on her face. For better or worse, the path was set. He turned back to the 3 Dornish women. Very well. We'll muster what we can. But we need an explicit plan. If we march blindly, we invite disaster. Nymeria produced a small roll of parchment from her sleeve, carefully smoothing it out on the table. We've marked potential routes from Dorne to the Crownlands. If we strike from the Boneway and Prince's Pass, we can come out near the Stormlands. From there, we can push north to King's Landing. Meanwhile, if you send your forces down the King's Road, they can move through the Riverlands, provided we secure alliances there. Sansa's eyes flicked to the scribbled lines on the parchment. The Riverlands are still reeling from the Frey's downfall and the wars. Some of those lords might be sympathetic to the Starks, remembering my mother's house, Tully. But we need to reach out to them quickly, ensure they won't close their gates to us or worse, ally with the crown out of fear. Tyene nodded. We can use ravens, though we should also send trusted envoys in person to treat with those lords. Obara tapped her finger on the lines indicating King's Landing. Cersei might attempt to rally what remains of the Reach or any loyalist Tarly men. The Tarly's main line was decimated, but they still have bannermen scattered. If she scrapes together enough support, she could counterattack. We'll need to be ready. Jon pushed a hand through his dark hair, exhaustion creeping in. We are basically looking at a new war. It might not be as large as the War of the Five Kings, but it will be bloody. And we must not underestimate Cersei's cunning. Nymeria's lips pressed into a slight smile. That is why we meet here under truce in your hall, to ensure we craft a plan that spares as many lives as possible. A swift, decisive campaign. Sansa felt the flicker of hope. The discussion reminded her of her father's war councils long ago. But back then, she was just a child dreaming of southern courts and chivalry. Now, she was grown, forged by betrayal and heartbreak, and she was determined not to let illusions distract her from the reality of war. We have an opportunity, she said, quietly yet firmly. If the North and Dorne unite, we can present a formidable front. The question is, can we count on anyone else? The Vale, perhaps. Jon considered. The Vale owes a debt to House Stark. Lord Robin Arryn is young and fickle, but he might be persuaded, especially if Lord Royce stands with us. Royce respects our name. Obara's eyes gleamed. The Vale's knights are strong, and they could join from the east, creating yet another front. That would leave Cersei scrambling to defend King's Landing from 3 directions: the north, the south, and the east. Tyene's voice was almost hushed with anticipation. So many fronts. She'll never be able to hold them all. Sansa's mind spun with the possibilities. We'll need to secure the salt of the Vale's ports, the grain of the Riverlands, and the fruit of Dorne to keep our armies supplied. Logistics must be in place before we march. Nymeria agreed, her tone crisp. We can handle some of the shipping along the coast. Dorne's ships are fewer than they were, but we still have a respectable fleet. We might even be able to bring some measure of trade from Essos. The key is to move quickly before Cersei can blockade us. Jon exhaled, leaning back. We have a plan forming, but we need to confirm these alliances swiftly. We'll send ravens tonight to the Vale and to the Riverlands. We'll ask for immediate envoys to come to Winterfell or, at the very least, meet us halfway at Moat Cailin. As for Dorne, He paused, looking at the sand snakes. Obara lifted her chin. We can dispatch riders at once to call our banners. The lords who remain loyal to House Martell will answer, and will muster them at Sunspear. Tyene added, but we'll remain here for a short while to finalize details, and then we'll have to depart. We can't leave Dorne without leadership for too long. Many houses do not trust each other since the upheaval caused by Illyria's takeover. We have to ensure unity, or our forces will be divided. At the mention of Illyria Sand, Sansa felt a pang of reminder. The woman who had once been Oberyn's paramour, who was rumored to have orchestrated Prince Doran's death. Her name carried a weight of scandal and conflict. Yet these three daughters, these sand snakes, seemed determined to hold Dorne together in the face of external threats. Jon said quietly, let's hope your lords in Dorne are more agreeable than some of ours. We'll see soon enough who stands with us. Dinner concluded with a strained sort of camaraderie, a forced attempt to celebrate an alliance not yet fully confirmed. The Sand Snakes and the Starks exchanged glances of mutual understanding, each from families that had suffered under Lannister might. The flickering torches on the walls cast wavering shadows, as though reflecting the uncertainty of the future. Yet under that shifting light, alliances were being forged, and war plans were already in motion. Over the following days, Winterfell bustled like an overturned anthill. Ravens shot off in all directions, carrying sealed letters bearing the wolf's head of House Stark, or, in some cases, the sun and spear of House Martell. Every morning, the courtyards filled with the sounds of blacksmiths hammering iron, fletchers crafting arrows, and soldiers drilling with spears and swords. Winter's chill nipped at every corner, but the flames of anticipation burned in the hearts of the castle's inhabitants. They knew another great conflict loomed. Sansa found herself in the library tower more often than not, poring over maps, old treatises on the political histories of the Seven Kingdoms, and any record of alliances between the North and Dorne. She discovered there were precious few. Historically, these two regions, one scorching and exotic, the other cold and severe, had rarely cooperated, even back to the days of the Targaryen conquest. Yet here they were, forging bonds that might reshape the realm. One late afternoon, she noticed Tyene entering the library, a curious expression on her face. Tyene approached quietly, the train of her Dornish gown trailing on the stone floor. Poring over tomes again, Lady Stark? You remind me of my sister Sarella. She'd prefer a library to a throne room any day. Sansa looked up, offering a polite smile. Knowledge can be a weapon, as potent as any spear. Tyene's mouth curved into a faint grin. So my father believed. He taught us that cunning and intellect could turn a fight before it's even begun. Sansa set aside her scroll. Is there something I can help you with? Tyene hesitated. I wanted to speak plainly, if I may. I see how you hold yourself, how you weigh each decision with such care. You remind me a bit of Prince Doran in that way. He was cautious, almost overly so. We Sand Snakes grew impatient under his slow stewardship of Dorne. Sometimes we suspected he never truly intended to take vengeance on the Lannisters. But I sense you are different. You are cautious, but you also have a steel in your spine that I respect. Sansa flushed slightly, not used to compliments from the Sand Snakes. Thank you. I just wish to protect my people. War is always a risk, but I cannot forgive the Lannisters for what they've done to my family. Tyene nodded solemnly. We share that wound. My sisters and I, we lost our father to their treachery. We won't rest until we see them pay. But I wanted to say, I hope this alliance can be more than just convenience. I hope, in some small way, it can heal old wounds between our peoples. Sansa tapped her fingers on the table. For so long, we believed the North fought alone. Dorne stayed out of southern conflicts. The Stormlands did as they wished. Now everything has changed. Perhaps a new era can begin. Tyene reached out and touched Sansa's hand lightly, a gesture of camaraderie. We have both endured so much. If we can stand together, maybe we can keep the realm from splintering into further chaos. She smiled softly. Even if it takes a war to remove the greatest source of that chaos. Sansa swallowed, feeling the magnitude of the moment. "We'll do what we must," she said. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a reminder of the harsh environment that shaped northern life. Tyenne's presence in the cold library, with her southern warmth and quiet cunning, felt symbolic of the bridge they were forging between two distant lands. For a moment, Sansa allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. If the alliance held, if the Riverlands and Vale joined, if the North marched swiftly, if Dorne launched a simultaneous assault, perhaps they really could overthrow Cersei. Perhaps the realm could know peace again. Down in the courtyard, Jon and Obara sparred in a light snowfall. Word had spread that the fierce Dornish warrior had challenged the king in the north to a friendly bout, curious to test his mettle. Men gathered around the edges of the yard to watch. Obara wielded a blunted spear, while Jon used a practiced sword. The day was gray, the stones were slick with half-melted snow, and the watchers' breaths fanned out in frosty plumes. Obara struck first, her spear whirling in a tight arc, forcing Jon to sidestep. She pressed the advantage, showing her agility even in the slippery conditions. Jon kept his sword in front, parrying or dodging her thrusts. It was clear she was testing him, seeing if the rumors of his skill were true. Jon found himself on the defensive initially. Obara's quick jabs kept him moving, the spear a deadly extension of her arm. He narrowed his eyes, studying her pattern, and then on her next strike, he pivoted swiftly. His sword tapped her spear aside, allowing him to close distance. Obara let out a grunt of approval, hooking her weapon around to catch his side. Jon blocked, but she was already spinning away. Their weapons clacked in sharp echoes. In the crowd, Nymeria and Tyene watched with interest. The northern onlookers whispered among themselves, placing mental bets. Jon Snow, rumored to have fought White Walkers, commanded a certain respect. But Obara Sand, daughter of the Red Viper, carried a lethal reputation. A feint from Jon nearly took Obara off guard, his practiced sword glancing off her left shoulder. She hissed, but adjusted swiftly, bringing the butt of her spear around to crack at Jon's midsection. Jon twisted, taking the blow on his arm, and retreated a step. Their eyes locked. Even in a friendly bout, the tension was real. Both fought in earnest, neither wanting to yield. Then, with a sudden shift in stance, Jon advanced. His sword was a blur of motion, feinting high but coming low. Obara parried with the spear's haft, but Jon's momentum drove her back a step. The watchers edged closer, enthralled. Obara set her feet again, lashing out with a quick stab toward Jon's thigh, but he managed a half-spin that put him inside her guard. With a controlled thrust, he placed the tip of his practiced sword against Obara's breastbone. She stopped dead. It was a stalemate, though, because she had the SP. Ears but braced against his ribs. Another move from either could shift the advantage. They locked eyes, breathing hard in the chilly air. Then, slowly, Obara smiled, a fierce, predatory grin. She stepped back, lowering her spear. "You're good," she admitted. "Better than I expected, even from the king in the north." Jon lowered his sword, exhaling. "You're quick, and you fight with precision." He rubbed the spot on his ribs where her spear had nearly winded him. Nymeria stepped forward, applauding softly. "Our father would have been impressed, Obara, if you ever bothered to show him such restraint." Obara snorted. "I was going easy. Next time, King Jon, we won't use training weapons." Jon gave a polite nod, acknowledging the half-challenge in her words. "We have more important battles to fight than each other," he said, not unkindly. The crowd dissipated as the soldiers returned to their drills, muttering about the spectacle. Jon noted a renewed measure of respect in the faces of the Dornish guards who had accompanied the Sand Snakes. Perhaps seeing their champion matched so effectively by the king in the north helped legitimize the alliance in their eyes. Meanwhile, the northern men realized these women from Dorne were not to be underestimated. In the days that followed, ravens returned with various seals. The Vale responded with cautious interest. Lord Royce insisted on meeting at the Crossroads Inn to discuss terms. The Riverlords were less decisive, though a few declared that they would consider marching if a broader coalition formed. None were eager to stand alone against the crown, but if the Vale and Dorne were both involved, they saw a real chance. Old grudges against the Lannisters simmered there as well. Memories of the sack of Riverrun, the Red Wedding, the betrayal by the Freys. A chance for retribution stirred men's hearts. The snows receded slightly, allowing some roads to clear. Preparations were underway for a grand war council at Moat Cailin, a place traditionally recognized as the gateway to the north, where envoys from the Vale, the Riverlands, and possibly even the Iron Islands would converge. The latter was a wild card, as no one knew for sure what the Ironborn might do in the wake of the Greyjoy conflicts. But it was worth extending an invitation. All the while, the specter of Cersei Lannister loomed. Whispers came from travelers that the Queen was furious at the North's rebuff and had demanded increased levies from Crownland lords. Rumors abounded that she had brokered a deal with the Company of the Cat or some other Associacelsword group to bolster the depleted Lannister ranks. Day by day, the tension tightened. War was inevitable. As the time for departure drew near, Jon arranged for a small retinue to travel south, escorting the Sand Snakes as they returned to Dorne to begin raising their banners. Sansa would remain at Winterfell for a short period to coordinate the northern mustering. Then she herself would travel to Moat Cailin to finalize alliances. The plan was for both armies, North and Dorne, to move toward King's Landing from their respective directions, meeting somewhere in the heart of the realm. If the Vale and the Riverlands joined, they would come in from the sides, pressing Cersei's forces into a tight ring. No easy feat, but if timed well, it could cripple the Lannister hold. 2 days before the Sand Snake's departure, a messenger arrived with a torn cloak and a panicked demeanor. He had come from the region near the Neck, breathless and mud-spattered. Before the great hall's assembled lords, he bowed low to Jon and Sansa, stammering out his news. "Your Graces," he panted, though Jon had never insisted on that style. "I've come to warn you. Lannister men have been sighted in the Riverlands, near Harrenhal. They've hired men. They're burning villages suspected of harboring your allies." A murmur of outrage spread through the hall. Sansa's stomach churned. That was an old tactic of the Lannisters. Sow terror and destruction to keep the populace from aiding rebels. Nymeria leaned forward, eyes flashing. They move more quickly than anticipated. Tyenne's face was grim. Cersei must have had these forces ready even as she sent her envoy. A typical ploy, offer peace while preparing war. Obara clenched her fists, the memory of the Lannisters' cruelty fueling her rage. "Then we cannot tarry." Jon nodded, jaw set in a hard line. "We leave as soon as we can muster. The Riverlands are vulnerable, and if the Lannisters secure Harrenhal, they can block much of our southern advance." Sansa stood, commanding the hall's attention. "We need to protect those who would become our allies. If we let Cersei burn them to ash, we will stand alone." The frantic messenger continued, voice shaking. "Yes, my lady. They burn farms, but they also speak of amassing near the God's Eye, preparing for—" He swallowed. "They say they plan to push north." Jon dismissed the messenger with thanks, offering him rest and food. Then he addressed the assembled crowd. "We move earlier than planned. Sansa, you'll remain here just long enough to rally the final forces, then follow." Sansa bowed her head in acknowledgement. "We'll not be far behind, brother." Obara stepped forward, gripped tight on her spear. "We will ride with you, but soon we must break off to head south. We cannot ignore Harrenhal if it stands as a threat to us as well." Nymeria and Tyene nodded in agreement, their faces set. There was no time left for subtlety or delicate negotiations. The lion was on the prowl, rearing its claws to strike at anyone who might stand against it. The only choice was to meet it head-on. Thus, the newly forged alliance began to mobilize. War horns sounded in Winterfell's courtyards, echoing through the ancient walls. Men scurried about to pack provisions, sharpen swords, and prepare horses for a long ride. Torches flared in the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating the somber faces of soldiers preparing for yet another battle. The Sand Snakes conferred with Jon, finalizing routes and coordination, before they too readied themselves to depart. Obara's warhorse pawed the ground eagerly, as though sensing her rider's thirst for vengeance. Nymeria and Tyene exchanged a final glance with Sansa, solemn and resolute. "You will have our spears," Tyene said softly. "Dorne and the North shall meet again on the battlefield. May we share victory." Sansa couldn't resist the bittersweet flicker of a smile. "Until then, may the gods old and new keep you safe." With that, the alliance between House Stark and the Sand Snakes set into motion the wheels of destiny that would soon shake the Seven Kingdoms. Columns of snow-dusted knights and foot soldiers began their slow progression down the King's Road, while smaller bands rode west to secure vital passes. Ravens flitted overhead, carrying last-minute messages to the Riverlands, the Vale, and beyond. The war drums of both the desert and the winter had begun to beat in unison, heralding a conflict that would converge upon the seat of Lannister power. From the high walls of Winterfell, Sansa watched the moving lines of troops until they disappeared into the hazy horizon. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and her heart pounded with a mix of dread and fierce resolve. She whispered a silent prayer for her brother and for all the warriors who followed him. And she whispered a vow that this time, the Lannisters would face the combined wrath of the North and Dorne, pincered between icy vengeance and scalding fury. The day of reckoning was coming, and the realm would tremble beneath the weight of their strike.